October 24th, a typical office meeting room, one you can find all over the world. The people in the room have gathered to review the quarterly business performance. And by the way, these are people you'd most often expect to see in such a meeting. You have Mr. M, the manager, Mr. H, the HR director, Mr. O from the operations department, Mr. T from IT, and a few other people. They have been doing these meetings every single quarter for the past few years. There was your typical chatter in the room, looking through reports, slide decks, and charts. Honestly, these people have been doing this for so long that they could probably do this with their eyes closed. But this meeting wasn't like every other meeting. Something was off. A single slide hidden halfway through a dense deck of charts, the kind most people click past without thinking. At first glance, nothing dramatic stood out. No red alarms, no bolded crisis font, no all caps urgent. Just a few percentages in a politely declining trend line. The kind of thing that tries to whisper its problems instead of screaming them. But numbers don't need to scream to tell you something has gone very, very wrong. Mr. H was in the middle of a sentence when he glanced at the screen and suddenly paused. This wasn't his typical behavior. Mr. H is known for being super intentional, prepared, even to a fault. So everyone knew something was wrong. And they didn't have to wait very long. There was this key performance indicator that the business cared most about. It was the customer ticket resolution. And Mr. H suddenly realized that it had quietly stalled and then began to slip. Not by much at first. A few hours here, a slight increase in backlog there, small enough that you could explain it away if you wanted to. Seasonal fluctuations, Mr. M would say, or we're just onboarding new people. But months later, the trend refused to reverse. Instead, it deteriorated. It wasn't a dramatic kind of failure. No headlines, no lawsuits, no recalls, no lost contracts, just a quiet decay. A decay that hid inside dashboards, one cell at a time, while everyone else went about their days believing the problem had already been solved. Which is why Mr. H and Mr. M hadn't seen it so far. They just assumed the problem was handled 3 months ago. Because 3 months earlier, there had been a training. At the end of that training, everyone involved believed the problem was fixed. But now, as everyone in the meeting room stared at the screen, they suddenly realized it wasn't. By the time the quarterly report came out, the KPI had already died. But the story didn't start with a failure. It started with optimism. Let's rewind a few months. The company had been struggling with customer requests for a while now, which is why the CEO had placed a high priority on the KPI for customer resolution. It wasn't anything catastrophic. No furious clients banging on the doors or threatening to cancel contracts. More like, you know, that annoying friction that makes customers sigh when they send an email and wonder when they'll hear back. The kind that makes internal teams straight Slack messages like, hey, did anyone ever respond to that? Or whose ticket is this supposed to be? Now, Mr. M had noticed and wanted to fix this as quickly as possible. The people at the heart of this were the project coordinators. Now, coordinators are interesting creatures in the corporate ecosystem. They're the connective tissue, if you will, the ones who make sure tasks get assigned, deadlines get tracked, and nobody drops the ball. They don't usually get incentive plans or spot bonuses or fancy leadership development workshops, but without them, the entire system collapses quietly under its own weight. Now, the business, and Mr. M in particular, wanted to help them. And more importantly, the business needed something from them: consistency. Specifically, consistency in how customer requests were received, documented, routed, escalated, and then closed. Now, the existing way of working was more improvisational. which is a polite way of saying everyone did what they thought was fastest in that moment. So the decision was made to introduce a formal workflow. On paper, it made perfect sense. Customers would get timely responses, coordinators would know exactly what to do, managers would be able to track bottlenecks, and someone finally figured out how to make all those color coded swim lane diagrams in PowerPoint useful. Now, the workflow had five main steps: intake, classification, assignment, escalation if required, and closure with customer follow up. Simple, logical, clean. But workflows don't live on paper. They live in systems and habits and incentives and culture and the small decisions humans make when the workload spikes at 5:30 p.m. and they just need to get one more request off their plate before the day ends. Now, at this point in the story, no one was thinking about that. They were thinking about the training. The training was scheduled for a Friday, which, if you've ever worked in corporate, you already know is a psychological gamble. People are either exhausted, mentally checked out, or trying to hit their weekly targets before the weekend. But the optimism persisted. The coordinators showed up. They took their seats. There were color markers and sticky notes and flip charts and printed handouts. The facilitator, an earnest L&D partner juggling five other initiatives, we'll call her Mrs. L, walked them through the new workflow step by step. People role played intake conversations. They practiced classifying functional customer scenarios. They shared tips, asked questions, compared notes. It felt like progress. Evaluations that day reflected the mood. Some excerpts from the feedback stated, very interactive and helpful. I finally understand how escalations works. Good session. Trainer was engaging. The manager, Mr. M, was pleased. Mrs. L, the L&D partner, was relieved because she only had about a week to design and deliver this training. The participants went home tired but satisfied. And honestly, if you were in that room, you would have thought the exact same thing. Because in the classroom, in that controlled, static, supportive environment, the coordinators looked and felt competent, confident even. They did all five steps correctly without hesitation. And that's the part that nobody talks about when they talk about training. Training rooms are not real life. In the training, the coordinators had time. They had clarity, they had attention, they had a facilitator. They had examples that conveniently matched the workflow. They had no conflicting priorities, no backlog, no customers pinging them repeatedly, no manager pacing behind them asking them when the report would be ready. They had practice. And practice isn't performance. But at the end, none of this mattered. The training was seen as the solution. The box was ticked, the workflow was launched, and the problem was considered fixed. Everyone moved on for about 3 weeks. 3 weeks after the training, the first small cracks appeared. A few customers' ticket lingered longer than usual. A handful of escalation emails arrived with a tone that was more confused than accusatory, the polite corporate equivalent of, "What's going on over there?" But early cracks are easy to ignore, especially when you believe a problem has already been solved. It wasn't until the end of the quarter that the full pattern became impossible to dismiss. The primary KPI the company cared about, customer ticket resolution time, had slipped from an average of 36 hours to 51 hours. That's a 42% increase in turnaround time. Not catastrophic, but deeply unpleasant if you're on the receiving end. Then there was the first contact resolution, the percentage of tickets solved without escalation. That one had dropped from 62% to 48% in the same period. And escalation volume, it more than doubled. By itself, any one of these changes could be waved off as noise or seasonality. Together, they were a quiet scream, which is why no one in the quarterly review meeting noticed them at first. But when Mr. H pointed it out, everyone took a pause and then started looking through the data. Customer complaints, which had previously hovered between 8 and 12 per week, began climbing. First to 15, then to 19, then to 21. Nothing viral, again, nothing scandalous, nothing that would make headlines, just customers noticing the slow bleed and politely letting the company know. On the dashboard, the trend line sloped downwards. Again, not dramatically, not the kind of plunge that makes executives shout across conference tables. More like a gentle slide, as if performance were slowly exhaling its final breath while everyone else looked in the other direction. And this is the moment Mr. M first saw the slide. This is the moment everyone in the meeting room first realized they had a murder on their hands, the KPI. Suddenly, the typical chatter in the meeting room died down and was replaced by people offering explanations. And in about 15 minutes later, Mr. H realized they weren't going to be able to solve this murder by themselves. It was time to call for help. And that's how Detective Addie Fields entered the story. Detective Addie showed up quietly. No dramatic entrances, no fanfare. She was introduced to Mr. M and his teams and was told that she was going to investigate this murder as quietly as possible. And she started where all good investigators start, by watching. She watched the coordinators as they handled tickets. She watched managers as they discussed priorities. She watched the workflow diagrams taped to the wall and the actual workflows playing out in people's screens. She watched how decisions were made under pressure. And she watched how often the new process was followed versus how often it was bypassed. She didn't interfere, she didn't correct, she just took notes. And from there, she began the first phase of her investigation, the interviews. Interview 1, the manager. Detective Addie always begins with the person who asked for the training. In this case, it was Mr. M, the manager responsible for the coordinators. His KPI dashboard was the one with the slope nobody wanted to talk about, so he had the most to lose and the strongest motivation to fix things. When the detective asked him what prompted the training, he didn't hesitate. They weren't following the workflow, he explained. It was simple in his mind. The new process had been documented, communicated, and demonstrated. There was even a slide deck. From his perspective, the coordinators knew what to do. They just weren't doing it. So he asked L&D to provide training on the workflow to ensure full adoption. He described the coordinators as capable but slow to embrace change. He believed the training had gone well, attendance was high, participation was good, feedback forms were positive. And when the detective asked him when he expected performance to improve, he paused. You could tell he hadn't been expecting the question. Eventually, he said something like, well, right after the training. He wasn't being arrogant or naive. He was describing what organizations often assume, that knowledge equals behavior and that understanding equals execution. If someone can explain how to do something, they will do it. When asked what happened after performance didn't improve, his tone shifted. He talked about resistance to change, lack of accountability, and the need for mindset shifts. From his perspective, the issue lived in the people. And if you've ever worked inside a business, you've heard someone describe the problem that way before. Finally, Detective Addie asked him one more question, the quiet kind that reveals more than it seems to. How do you evaluate coordinators today? The answer came quickly, on response time, not on accuracy, not compliance to workflow, not closure quality, not documentation completeness, not even customer satisfaction. Speed, a tiny detail. But tiny details often explain a lot. Interview 2, L&D. Next, the detective spoke with the L&D partner, Mrs. L, the person who had designed and delivered the training. She remembered the request clearly. The manager had come to her with a problem already defined and a solution already chosen. He asked for training and she provided training. Not because she lacked expertise or imagination, but because that's the role L&D often ends up playing in organizations. Order takers instead of consultants. She described the participants warmly: engaged, cooperative, smart. She also described the training itself. It was interactive and hands on and scenario based. She had done everything right within the boundaries she was given. When asked about the business problem, she admitted that she hadn't seen the performance data before the workshop. She didn't know the KPIs and she didn't know the baseline numbers and she didn't know the level of change required. She also hadn't observed the coordinators doing the workflow in real life. There wasn't time. I mean, she only had a week to do everything. And it's not like she had permission to ask. When the detective asked if she believed the coordinators understood the new workflow after the training, she didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. And she was right. In the training room, they did. Before the detective left, she asked Mrs. L if she believed the training was the right solution. She paused a little bit longer this time. It helped, she said, but it wasn't enough. L&D rarely gets to say that out loud. Interview 3: The coordinators. Talking to the coordinators felt different, less performative, less polished. They were in the middle of the work, not above or around it. When asked about the training, they mostly had positive things to say. They liked the facilitator, Mrs. L. They liked the practice. They liked that someone finally explained the workflow in a structured way. But when Detective Addie asked them how often they used the new workflow in real life, they did something interesting. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they laughed. Not like in a mocking way, but in that exhausted, slightly ironic way people laugh when the truth is obvious, but a little bit awkward. Eventually, one of them explained the situation without realizing she was explaining the case. If I use the new workflow, it just takes longer. Not because coordinators were slow, not because they were resistant, but because the tools they relied on, the ticketing platform, the communication channels, the templates, hadn't been updated to support the new process. To follow the workflow, they had to open multiple tabs, enter the same information twice, and wait for approvals that rarely came on time. Customers, meanwhile, were still emailing directly or calling when they got impatient, and managers still measure them on speed, not on quality. So they did what humans always do when incentives collide with instructions: they optimized for survival. One of the coordinators said, "If I don't use the workflow, I can close a ticket in half the time." They weren't resisting change, they were resisting inefficiency. And honestly, who wouldn't? Interview 4: Operations. The final interview in this phase was with the process owner, Mr. O, the person who had designed the new workflow. He was thoughtful, methodical. He described the workflow in beautifully logical terms: boxes connected by arrows, clear roles, clear handoffs, clear escalation paths. He had thought of everything, except how people actually behaved. When the detective asked why the ticketing system weren't updated to reflect the new process steps, he explained that IT needed a longer lead time. Priorities had been elsewhere, resources were tight, the workflow was ready long before the tools were. When asked why coordinators weren't measured on workflow compliance, he explained that KPIs were owned by the business and couldn't easily be changed without executive alignment. When asked how coordinators were expected to use the new workflow without supportive systems or updated KPIs, he paused. They were told to. In that moment, the case became a little bit clearer. Not solved or finished, but clearer. After the interviews, Detective Addie moved on to the second phase of her investigation: evidence collection. This is where cases like this usually get interesting. Not because the evidence is dramatic, but because it's quiet. Corporate crime scenes rarely involve smashed windows or missing jewelry. They involve email threads, outdated templates, and dashboards no one wants to open. Addie began with the training request email. One email states the coordinators need training on the new workflow so they can apply it consistently and reduce customer complaints. Short, direct, and most importantly, it identified the solution, aka training, before it identified the problem, aka reduce customer complaints. She then reviewed the workflow documentation. It was immaculate. Flowcharts, decision trees, RASI matrices, the kinds of documentation that gives project managers goosebumps. Every arrow pointed somewhere, every box had a purpose, every escalation path had a contingency step. Then she examined the ticketing platform. This is where things began to diverge. Workflow step 3, classification, not reflected in the system UI. Workflow 4, escalation, buried behind 3 clicks. Workflow step 5, closure and follow up, optional, not required for ticket closure. In other words, the system didn't enforce the workflow, it didn't even encourage it, it just sort of tolerated it. Addie dug further and reviewed the performance logs. Out of 1,120 tickets processed in the quarter, 44% bypassed the new intake category entirely. 37% had no classification metadata, 24% were closed without follow-up. First contact resolution fell from 62% to 48%. Average resolution time increased from 36 hours to 51 hours. Escalations more than doubled, from 9% to 21%. This wasn't a workflow problem, it was a workflow adoption problem. But even adoption problem was just too vague. There was more to uncover. Addie next examined the templates the coordinators used to communicate with customers. Half of them were stored in an old shared folder. Some were ancient Word docs with names like client underscore follow up underscore final underscore real. Puns like that should qualify as cultural artifacts in anthropology. Then came the feedback forms from the training. All positive, all glowing, all sincere. And as any seasoned L&D practitioner knows, small sheets are the most reliable way to measure how much fun people had, not whether anything changed. Before leaving this phase of her investigation, Addie did one more thing. She checked Slack. This is where true corporate anthropology lives, if you ask me. Buried in a thread titled Workflow Questions, a coordinator had written, if the customer emails directly, should I still log it in the system first or just forward it to ops? Forwarding is faster, right? The reply was instant. Just forward it. Customer's waiting. Not malicious, not rebellious, just practical. Workflows don't die from dramatic acts of resistance. They die from 1,000 small acts of reason. With evidence collected, Detective Addie turned to the autopsy, the part of the case where we stop asking how people felt and start asking what actually happened. The business had expected the new workflow to shorten resolution times, reduce escalations, increase first time contact resolution, improve customer satisfaction. But the data told a different story. Resolution time, on average, 42% slower. First contact resolution, 14 points lower. Escalations, 133% higher. Backlog, 28% higher. Customer complaints, increased by 2.1 over baseline. And then came the most revealing metric, one the manager had not mentioned during his interview. Ticket volume closed outside workflow, 40% of total, meaning nearly half of all tickets were being resolved the old way. And this is where Detective Addie paused, because this was the first moment where the cause of death began to take shape. If the coordinators were truly resistant, they wouldn't close the tickets at all. If they lacked knowledge, they would escalate more or freeze. If they lacked skill, errors would increase. And none of those patterns were present. They were closing tickets, just not using the workflow to do it. And to Detective Addie, the implication was obvious. The old way was faster. But Addie was taught not to jump to conclusions. Instead, she accumulated. So she noted the final autopsy findings and closed her notebook. Official cause of death, preliminary. Performance died from environmental contradiction. Not because people didn't understand the new way of working, but because the environment rewarded the old way. And humans, at work or anywhere else for that matter, are exquisitely sensitive to incentives. After interviews and evidence collection, Detective Addie moved on to the next phase of her investigation, identifying suspects. Not individuals to shame, not villains to expose, but logical actors who had the motive, means, and opportunity to contribute to the quiet death of performance. Four suspects emerged from the case file: Mr. M, the manager; Mrs. L, the L&D partner; the coordinators; and the system and culture. Each had different relationships to the case, and none of them acted alone. Addie started with the most obvious one. Suspect 1, the manager. Motive: resolve customer complaints, improve KPIs, predict quarterly numbers, avoid escalations, and be seen as decisive. Managers have a lot to lose when performance falters. Customers don't complain to coordinators, they escalate to leaders, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly. And Mr. M had means: authority to request the training, to influence priorities, to pressure for speed, and to approve or bypass tools. Managers rarely update workflows themselves, but they can make or break adoption through what they reward. Finally, Mr. M had opportunity. He had requested the training and he measured speed. He modeled the old behavior and he did not update the incentives. It would be easy to paint him as the villain here, but if you've ever led a team with numbers attached to your name, you know how survival instincts work. Managers don't wake up wanting to kill performance, they wake up wanting to avoid being blamed for killing performance. Suspect number 2, L&D. Motive: respond to stakeholder requests, demonstrate value, maintain relationships, deliver solutions quickly. In many organizations, L&D is evaluated not on performance outcomes, but on responsiveness and satisfaction, two metrics that quietly incentivize compliance over inquiry. And Mrs. L had the means. She was responsible for designing and delivering the training, facilitating expertise, keeping control over the classroom, influencing over cognition, understanding. She also had opportunity. Designed the training instead of diagnosing the problem, she focused on knowledge instead of behavior and accepted the stakeholder solution as the right one. But here's the thing: Mrs. L didn't invent the problem. The solution was handed to her, pre selected, pre interpreted, pre approved. If Mrs. L had pushed back, would the manager have listened? Would she have had time to investigate or permission to observe? Access to the systems? Probably not. The role of L&D played wasn't malicious, it was systemic, habitual. She was doing her job as the organization had defined it. Suspect number 3, the coordinators. Motives: finish work on time, avoid escalations, keep customers satisfied, minimize rework, and stay afloat. Coordinators don't get bonuses for theoretical adoption of workflows. They get peace when customers stop chasing them. They had the means. They processed the tickets, they control the workflows, they chose the fastest route under pressure. They also had the opportunity. They bypassed the workflow not out of rebellion, but out of logic. When the new workflow forced them to spend double the time for the same result, they reverted to the old way. Not because they didn't care, but because they did. Had they followed the workflow strictly, tickets would have piled up even faster. And then they'd be accused of something else: inefficiency. Humans are, again, exquisitely adaptive creatures, especially when survival is at stake. Finally, suspect 4, the systems and culture. Motive: none. Systems don't have motives. That's what makes them so dangerous. Means: tools were not updated, templates were outdated, KPIs rewarded speed, escalations penalized slowness, leadership rewarded quantity, customers expected fast replies. Opportunity every single day. Incorporating a new workflow into a legacy environment without aligning systems, incentives, and culture is like routing traffic onto a bridge that doesn't exist yet and blaming drivers for ending up in the river. At this stage of the investigation, each suspect had plausible involvement, but the real breakthrough came in the next phase of the case. Because suspects are interesting, but suspects reveal very little without assessing causality. Detective Addie came up with several hypotheses and tested each one against the evidence. Let's take a closer look. Hypothesis 1: the coordinators just don't want to change. Rejected. Evidence: they performed well in training, they could articulate the workflow steps, they understood the logic, they processed high ticket volume. Errors didn't significantly increase, they reverted only when the workflow slowed them down. This wasn't resistance, this was rational prioritization. Hypothesis 2: the training was ineffective. Partially rejected. The training did what training can do: teach, demonstrate, practice, clarify, motivate. What it couldn't do was change systems, templates, incentives, KPIs, customer expectations, or managerial priorities. Training cannot fix what training does not control. Hypothesis 3: the manager didn't enforce the workflow. Also partially rejected. Managers cannot enforce what they never modeled and what the environment punished. And enforcement without incentive alignment is not change, it's theater. Hypothesis 4: the workflow itself was flawed. Rejected. The workflow was logically sound, it just wasn't behaviorally viable. The bridge was well designed, it just wasn't built. At this point, Addie had enough evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events, the part of the investigation where the case finally begins to make sense. Timeline reconstructions are rarely glamorous in corporate cases. They don't involve chase scenes or midnight confessions. They involve inboxes and meetings and deadlines, places where life happens quietly and problems accumulate silently. Still, Detective Addie laid out the case chronologically. Week -4, workflow designed. Logical, structured, optimistic, no system updates, no KPI changes. Status of victim, not dead yet. Week -2, training requested. Solution chosen before problem defined. Training framed as adoption mechanism. Status of victim, not dead yet. Week 0, training delivered. Participants attentive, engagement high, evaluations glowing. In the room, competence, clarity, time. Status of victim, not dead yet. Week +1, return to work. Environment unchanged, systems unchanged, templates unchanged, KPIs unchanged, customer expectations unchanged, manager priorities unchanged. The only thing that changed was awareness of the ideal state. Status of victim, conditions emerge. Week +2, first friction. Workflow slows coordinators down. Tickets begin bypassing the process, escalations increase as customers wait. Status of victim, incentives misaligned. Week +3, human adaptation. Coordinators revert to old behaviors, not maliciously, efficiently. Status of victim, behavior optimized for survival. Week +6, metrics expose the reality. The dashboard reveals the flat line. Resolution time up, escalations up, complaints up, compliance down. Status of victim, confirmed dead. Week +12, leadership acceptance. Meetings begin focusing on root causes. Suspicions move from people to process to system to culture. Case opened. By the end of the reconstruction, no one in the room could reasonably claim the coordinators lacked knowledge or lacked willingness. They lacked support. The workflow required time, clarity, practice, updated systems, aligned incentives, and managerial reinforcement. It received training instead. After the reconstruction, Detective Addie closed her notebook. The pattern was obvious now, even before we named it. So, who killed the performance? Was it the manager, the coordinators, L&D, the process owner, the system? The answer, of course, was all of them, but also none of them. Performance didn't die because someone made a terrible decision. It died because a series of reasonable decisions collided in unreasonable ways. The manager asked for speed. L&D provided training, the process owner provided clarity, the coordinators provided labor, the system provided friction, and the culture provided incentives. And together, they produced a beautiful paradox. The new workflow was the right way of work. The old workflow was the only way to survive. Between correctness and survival, humans will always choose survival. That's not resistance, that's logic. It would be comforting if this case were rare, if it were unusual, if it were the kind of corporate tragedy people tell as a cautionary tale about one misguided project, but it isn't. More often than not, performance doesn't die loudly, it dies quietly. In email threads, in outdated systems, in KPIs that reward the past, in assumptions about what training can fix. A well intentioned decision that never intersects with the messy realities of work. Training is powerful, but learning is only the beginning. Behavior lives in the environment. People don't resist change, people resist being punished for changing. In the end, no one in this story acted with bad intent. The manager wanted customers to be happy, L&D wanted to support the business. The coordinators wanted to do their jobs, the process owner wanted consistency, and the system wanted nothing at all. And yet, performance still died. Not from ignorance, not from incompetence, not from defiance, but from a system asking for one thing while rewarding another. And as long as organizations keep prescribing training for problems that aren't about knowledge, cases like this will continue quietly, patiently, predictably. And this was the case of the dead performance. What are your thoughts on it? Let us know in the comments below. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep learning.